Hey class, these are the video lecture notes for Chapter 29, Wilsonian Progressivism at Home and Abroad. Next slide. The 1912 presidential campaign was a three-way race between William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. All three of these men hoped to continue the mantle of the label of progressivism, which was a key movement in American history. Next slide. Woodrow Wilson emerged victorious as Roosevelt and Taft split the Republican vote. This was a very interesting presidential election. Taft was the incumbent president after having been elected in 1908. Roosevelt had been president for almost 8 years after the death of William McKinley and was very popular. And Woodrow Wilson was the relative unknown in this election, and he came out of the academic world into politics. And this electoral map shows that Wilson was able to win a majority of the electoral vote, largely due to the fact that Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote. Next slide. Wilson called his program, quote, New Freedom, end quote. It sought to promote small enterprise and the, quote, fragmentation of big business. Wilson's approach to progressivism was to pass legislation to limit the power of big business and other powerful entities in American society. He wasn't a trust buster like Roosevelt and Taft, but he did believe in small business versus big business. Next slide. Wilson idealistically believed government could reform the wickedness of society. Wilson was the son of a preacher. He believed strongly in the concepts of good and evil, and he believed that government was if used correctly, could be a positive force in fixing some of the ills of society that had come as a result largely of the Industrial Revolution. Next slide. Wilson attacked the, quote, wall of privilege, end quote, the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. Those were three major targets of Wilson. He favored, as most Democrats did of his day, lowering the tariff, regulating the banks, and trying to, through legislation, break up trusts. Next slide. Wilson's domestic program included a graduated income tax, a reformed banking system, and Federal Trade Commission. Probably of those three, for us, the most important legacy of Wilson's presidency economically and in terms of what affects us would be the introduction of the income tax, which was something new at the time and seen as a way of leveling society, and very controversial. But today, of course, it is the major way that the federal government gets its revenue. Next slide. Wilson's nomination of reformer Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court was important to making his progressive plans a reality. Many of Wilson's programs and policies were challenged in the courts, and without the support of a court system, the bulk of his policies would have been perhaps overturned. But the court was relatively friendly to his program. Next slide. In spite of his anti-imperialist philosophy, Wilson carried on many of the policies of Theodore Roosevelt and Taft. Wilson was, to his core, anti-imperialist, but as president, he had to respond to international events, and his presidency would be in many ways dominated by international events. Next slide. The United States became embroiled in the Mexican Revolution of 1913 and the pursuit of Pancho Villa. Mexico was in turmoil during much of Wilson's presidency. A revolution and a struggle for power was taking place in that country between many rival factions. Pancho Villa was one of the more significant Mexican revolutionary leaders of this era. He had his own private army, and he led a raid across the American border into New Mexico. The city was Columbus, New Mexico, I believe. And in response, Wilson ordered an American military force into Mexico to apprehend Villa. And this became one of the more interesting events of Wilson's presidency. Villa and his forces eluded capture, and he became a legendary figure in Mexico. But this event for America and Wilson showed that Wilson was willing to use American forces overseas. Next slide. When World War I broke out in the summer of 1914, Wilson proclaimed American neutrality. The United States was not directly involved in the start of World War I. And Wilson, in speech after speech, proclaimed American neutrality. Next slide. Many American companies made huge profits in selling war materials and other goods to the combatants. It was because of this issue later on that the United States would get dragged in basically to World War I. Next slide. The sinking of the Lusitania killed over 1,000 civilians, and among these 128 were Americans. This event turned public opinion against Germany. This is an artist's depiction of the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania was sunk in May of 1915. The Lusitania was one of the world's largest passenger ships. It was owned by a British shipping company. The Germans claimed that this ship was carrying war materials, which we now know that it was through research. And this event almost got the United States into World War I. Germany, because of American outrage, apologized to the United States, and they temporarily stopped sinking civilian ships. And this action by Germany probably kept the United States out of the war until 1917. Next slide. Wilson won re-election in 1916 on the slogan, quote, "He kept us out of war," end quote. Wilson clearly wanted the United States out of war. Unfortunately for him and the United States, circumstances would change in 1917. Next slide. And that's it for Chapter 29, class. Talk to you later.